we're moving on to our first fireside chat of the day. Esther, very happy to introduce a friend and a brilliant person, Esther Dyson. Thank you. Well, look at your background. I love that. What's going on? Your fridge, your shower. What is that, Esther?
I found it online in March of 2020. It was called the COVID commute. And I thought, oh, great, I'll put this thing up here for the next couple of weeks while this COVID thing is happening. And I haven't found anything better yet, though I'm open.
I like it. Let me give a little background on Esther for everybody who doesn't, or anybody who doesn't know you. Esther is an investor, author, commentator, philanthropist, full-time founder of Wellville, which we'll talk a little bit about. And aside from Wellville, her primary activity is investing and working with early stage companies and, people. She and I talk a lot about how important, finding the right people to collaborate with is. Focusing on health, human capital, logistics, actually also space, also health tech a bunch. We're chat today, we're going to talk about roller coaster stories on investing and advice for people building businesses powered by AI, from healthcare to human capital, aerospace, and much more. Esther, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, and welcome, and glad to be here, ironically, in the same office Evan uses.
Yeah, we share offices for everybody to know inside the Ezra office, which is one of our co-investments together. So just kicking it off, we'll talk about the past a little bit first, Esther, and then get into the present and then talk about the future. So you've had a variety of different roles throughout your career, from a writer, an investor. What are your biggest inspiration to transition from one role to the next? We've talked about how these roles change, and if you look back at some of them, what inspired you the most to transition from a successful writer career to something else and new projects?
Precisely, success means I want to learn more about something else. Curiosity is my guiding principle. So for what it's worth, my dad's boss was Oppenheimer. I grew up at the Institute for Advanced Study amidst Nobel Prize winners. And yes, I met Einstein, but wow. I was more interested in my first grade teacher because she was really important to me. And so I started out as a reporter, a fact checker. And in essence, I would say that the primary skill for human beings vis-a-vis AI is asking good questions, because AI can find the answers. They may not be correct. They may be hallucinations. So you need to keep asking more questions. Is this true? What shows it's true? And then even more interesting, why is it true? What's the underlying model that makes this all plausible? And every once in a while, you discover a well-known fact, like the world is flat. There's this hallucination that it's round. This is like millennia ago.
Amazing.
It turned out the hallucination was right.
And so that's a challenge. I mean, figuring out which answers. Well, I taking a step back, I think it's really hard to ask really good questions. And that actually is the hardest thing. And as you're saying with new AI advancements, not only is it hard to ask the right contextually relevant question, but how do you trust the answer? And as a journalist, I mean, that was a big part. For 25 years, you had a newsletter called Release 1.0, which focused on analysis and projections of emerging tech. And so back then, as a foundation for this conversation, Esther, like, how did you, ask the right, how did you find truth in the answers or enough substance to believe in what all these technologists were telling you back then? What was it like writing a newsletter then when everybody was saying the world's flat, but it's actually round?
That's the perfect question, Evan. And the answer is more questions. And again, questions that, how does this work? I can see what it does. And, in many cases, that's all you need to know if there's enough people around you that you trust. But sometimes you need to, well, what does this really mean? And what assumptions are underlying my question and the answer? And honestly, I spent a lot of time in Russia. It's not a role, but it certainly was something I did.
Sure.
And looking at something from outside, why don't the people in the stores smile? Why don't they answer the phone at work? Turns out the answer was, well, if somebody's calling me at work, they probably have a problem. why should I, bother with somebody else's problem? And there wasn't this notion of upselling that that's the basic American assumption.
Sure. Just kind of a context. We talked a little bit about some of the rooms you were in when you were reporting 20 years ago, and like there must be some interesting questions that you asked somebody. You said you were in rooms with Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Sergey or others. I mean, like, what's the most intriguing question that you might remember?
That's such a good question. I can't retrieve it right away. It will probably come up. I mean,
okay.
Lots of interesting things. I met Steve Jobs. Well, maybe the question was, would you like a Diet Coke? Met Steve Jobs, I think, in like 1979, 1980,
wow.
At the conference that I then bought from its owner, Ben Rosen. For some reason, he held it at the Playboy Club on Lake Michigan. And so my meeting with Steve Jobs was with him, Regis McKenna, the famous PR guy, and we were served Diet Cokes by a Playboy bunny.
Oh my goodness.
I still have the little ashtray.
It's a little strange, but definitely an example of the times.
Yeah.
I started reading, we met indirectly in the mid 90s when I started reading your release 1.0, and fast forward, thrilled to become friends. One of the things, and that was when I was working at Home Network in Silicon Valley. Wow, 29 years ago. What technological advancements excited you most in 1995? And what tech advancement excites you the most today?
Okay, 1995. I mean, it was the internet in some sense. So the conference I ran was called PC Forum, Personal Computer Forum, starting in 1982. And in 2007, it was called Platforms for Communication Forum. And so it was that transition. Again, having been in Russia, it was interesting. The internet in Russia was basically used by finance people because it was the only time to get real-time information and sort of keep in touch with what was happening in the world. Whereas in the US, the personal computer was, oh yeah, we'll use it to store recipes. And then there were chat groups and things. But sure. watching the business models emerge, watching free software, paid software, then everything you got was online. The disks disappeared. At the same time, I'd already been writing about AI. In 1986, I wrote about this guy, Doug Lenat. And when you talk about AI and LLMs, so I remember getting on an airplane and seeing somebody with, we called them luggables. Remember,
what's a luggable?
It is a small personal computer that you can lug around as opposed to, this big thing on your desktop. Sure. And so, oh my God, there's somebody up there in first using a luggable.
Using a luggable.
Compact or something, yeah. And, now it's like, oh, they're using AI. But the reality is AI has been around for a long, long time. And the first AI was, on the one hand, there was this sort of natural language understanding, which was sort of, it wasn't automatic. So you kind of had to train it by hand versus now generative AI generates its own, it's not understanding, but its own predictions.
Right.
And so back then, another one was logic models. If A equals B, then C equals D. They were called expert systems. And they tried to sell them to doctors, and doctors said, we don't need no experts. So then they started calling them assistants. But it was basically...
And back then, Esther, sorry to interrupt. And back then, I mean, it felt like this was, everybody said this is never going to happen. Right. And I mean, like, this is, I mean, or maybe some people said it was going to happen and most said it wasn't. I always get this, people say, Evan, that's crazy. That's never going to happen. And there's this always balance. We're going to talk today about that. And later in some sessions like this, what is realistic versus unrealistic, and who has the right, question or answers to figure out. Timing is probably the most important issue with all of that, isn't it?
If you're an investor.
But also if you're an entrepreneur, right?
Yes, but if you're the public at large,
right,
the most important question is, do I have access to it? Who controls it?
Right.
So at some point, there may be AIs that somehow, put it this way, there's this wonderful science fiction story where there's a bunch of, they were called extraterrestrials, but we would probably call them bots. So they're looking down on Earth and it's really strange. They think with meat. There's this DNA stuff in a casing, and they think with this wet stuff. It's chemistry. And so, as a scientist or pseudoscientist, whatever, but I'm prepared to believe that at some point, why shouldn't the magic of life occur electronically as well as in chemistry and physics? I don't know. And if they're better than us, God bless them. But right now,
right,
where the business models come from, where the goals come from, is human beings running companies, or maybe trying to destroy a government, or maybe just trying to get rich. And so it's what those humans, either on purpose or inadvertently, cause those machines to do, how they program / prompt the AI. That's the thing I'm worried about as a citizen, a human.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk. We're going to talk deeper about that in a couple of minutes. Let me just give the audience a little bit of context. Right now, for a 10-year project, you started Wellville. Tell the audience a little bit more about Wellville and the goal, and what was the biggest learnings and challenges, real quickly, just because it's a very exciting,
right,
and it's a big part of who you are and your goals. So I'd love to share that with the audience, and then we'll get more into the challenges with AI and technology.
So Wellville was basically a response to working and investing in healthcare, being on the board of 23andMe, stuff like that. Why are we spending so much money fixing people who should not have been broken? Mm-hmm. Why is healthcare is mostly this large repair operation? And couldn't we do better maintenance? Couldn't we do better upstream? So I just recently published an article on theinformation.com, and it's also in 4 awkward chunks on LinkedIn because the amount of space is too short, called "Don't Fuss About Training Your AIs, Train Your Babies."
Right.
And the notion here is we need better people to direct the AI, to give it goals, to ask it good questions. And better people I would define as kids who are both secure but not terrified, kids who are curious and follow their curiosity, kids who are both self-aware and, especially in this world, aware of the motivations of other people and of all the business models they encounter, which is, so business models they encounter. What did I discover at Wellville? The big thing really was about addiction. And addiction is the short-term, short-sighted, constricted craving for something that does not relieve that craving. And yes, it's drugs and opioids, but it's also likes or adulation on Facebook or TikTok. But it's also community organizations addicted to short-term grants. They can't live beyond the current grant cycle because they both have short vision, and it's legitimate. I mean, if they don't pay that part-time coordinator, their thing is going to shut down.
Right.
And their dealers are often philanthropies who make them compete for grants rather than say, we want to solve this problem. We're going to fund the community to come together to solve it. And at the other end, lots of VCs and private equity, they're not in the business of building sustainable businesses. They're basically building body parts to be sold or shiny things to go public. And we're a short-term and self-centered society, which is it's all the stuff you're seeing today. That actually, I thought of this morning. I wanted to talk to the Democratic Party because in the end, that's my affiliation. Angel investors' job is not to pick winners. It's to find great teams and to help them become winners and to work with other angels, because
Sure.
you need, and VC's job may be to pick winners or to pick companies that are bad to IPO. And in the same way, I would say in the political climate, it's not like find the winner. It's find the person who can become a winner if we coalesce around them and support them. Because it's not the person only. It's the organization,
the person,
policy,
the organization,
people.
Exactly right. And so when that, and I totally agree with you. And when you're talking about transit, it's a perfect transition to, like, as an investor, when you're choosing on, you get presented probably many emails. You might talk with a small percentage of them, and you might have a follow-up call. How do you choose? I mean, you've invested in well-known companies and others that might not be as well known: Evernote, Flickr, Mashery. Good friends are the founders there. Meetup, also good friends. 23andMe, Ezra, which is where we share the office. So how do you choose?
Bridge.ai.
Bridge.ai. So we're going to talk about Latimer as well. And so how do you choose those people? I mean, what is the style or what aspects excite you?
Right. So there are two fundamental assumptions here. One is you have to be lucky. And I've been very lucky. I had enough, and not just lucky in your investments, but lucky enough to have enough assets so that, suppose 70% of the time you are, quote, right. 30% of the time you will lose money. And if that 30% means you have no money left, you can just be knocked out of the game immediately. So unfortunately, wealth is even more unevenly distributed than income. And people don't focus on that enough. They look at income only. So first of all, there was that. If you just kind of avoid the bottom 30 or 40%, and you have enough time for the math to work, you can do pretty well. And then occasionally you get lucky. I invested in Square, whatever, in my 50K turned into 20 million, and then, up and down. But so there's that. There's also, I invest for myself. I don't invest for other people. So LDV and VCs in general, they have limited partners. And if they lose money, someone's going to say, why did you do this stupid thing?
Sure.
And
as long as you find enough others that are the outliers that you deliver the return. So it's a balancing act.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And we're known actually for that early stage deep tech. People say, Evan, that's technically physically impossible, but if it works, if those people
it pays for everything.
It pays for everything. And so there's that balance. And back to what we were thinking about is, like, for us, we love deep domain expertise, like an unfair advantage of some domain that says this is where the industry is going. Probably similar to the way, we started LDV in 2012. We said the future is visual tech, and everybody said cute niche and science fiction. That's never going to happen. And then I think the biggest part, and everybody uses different words, is hustle or execution or, words like that. Making stuff happen is very important. But I don't know which one of those, and other personality traits, like, excites you when you get off the phone and say, oh my God.
Well, so first of all, it's the problem. Is it an interesting problem?
Right.
Is it a problem worth solving? Is it useful? I mean, you can make a lot of money in cosmetics. I'm just not interested. Sorry.
Right.
And second, do I fundamentally like the person? They will inevitably have problems. Well, why did I ever invest in this idiot? Versus, I want to help them. I want to make this work. And the third, again, is curiosity. Will I learn something? So I make my investments on the basis of, I'm investing in an education, and then there's a lottery ticket of a financial return thrown in. So, which you can do as a person. You can't do that as a fund for other people. And I mean, and that's why I went to Russia. That's why I trained to be a cosmonaut. That's why I got into healthcare. And that's why I got into Wellville. I knew nothing, but I was sure I would know a lot more by the end, and I do.
And you do. Absolutely. Yeah. So that you mentioned a couple sectors, healthcare and a bunch of others, and also in our chats recently, you've talked a little bit about a couple other ones like insurance. Tell us, why, how that inspires you or how that relates to everything.
Okay. So that's a great one. And people don't talk about it. People think it's really boring. So insurance does two things. One, it spreads the risk. So again, you don't go below this zero that is so dangerous for so many people. But really good insurance reduces the risk. And that's the insurance, we want to insure you if we discover you haven't been using your seatbelt. Yeah. And people will sign, they sometimes rarely notice, but this notion of, probably the best example is fire insurance. It's not simply, we'll look at your building and assess your risk. It's, we will look at your building and require you to test your fire alarms every year. We'll look for loose trash next to the electrical system. And that, I'm hoping, so how do you regulate AI? This is more relevant than you'd think. Laws are really tough. They depend on a vigilant government that is usually much slower than the bad people or the people who use careless business models. But imagine if you have liability,
right?
And then the insurance companies become the specialists in understanding what the AI is doing, what its business model is, what the law is. And so they become inspectors in a way that a lot of people, including me, would not want the government to be. But having a market, so that's why.
So one of those, but that's a perfect example. So one of the, it was interesting. This might relate, and you might aspects you might like or dislike. I feel the same. I like and dislike. But years ago, I went to go rent a car in Europe, and they said, "Oh, by the way, there might or might not be a box in your car that knows if you are speeding or not. And if you get in an accident when you're speeding, you're not covered. But if you and so I said, okay, well, that's amazing." On one hand, because I think a lot of people then will drive more safely because they'll get caught. They won't be covered. On the other hand, it feels like a little bit of an invasion. But to me, I think it's better if it saves more people's lives and is a positive impact for roads and driving than not. And so I think those things are might be an example of what you're talking about.
Exactly. But it's not an invasion. You have the right to say no.
Correct.
And then you go to some shady.
Well, that actually Esther, they didn't give me the right to say no. This is an Italian. I'm fluent in Italian, but I think I understood. I either could rent a car or not.
No, but you could find a different car. That's what I'm trying to say. You could say no. You were not forced to make this bargain. You could borrow a friend's car. You could steal a car, different kinds of liability.
Right.
But there's always a trade-off between transparency and privacy. And the more power you have, the less power you deserve. And so and that's why government interference is much worse than private interference, because in the private sector, you can usually walk away. You might have choices you consider impossible.
Right.
But in the end, and famous people, I want to know what's going on with Biden's health. I want to know what's going on. Kate Middleton doesn't actually have any power, so never mind. But it's just the more public you are and the more power, the more uneven the relationship is, the more transparency is required of the one with the power.
Absolutely. Let's talk about a couple of visual tech companies you've invested in Ezra and Open Water and a couple others, to highlight a couple that you've invested in that leveraging visual tech, which relates to our thesis. And then we'll transition to a couple other questions about, thinking about the future.
Yeah, I don't know whether you count DNA and genetics, looking at it as visual.
Depending on some of the tools, absolutely.
Yes,
some of the visualization and the microscopes, and absolutely is a piece of it. And when we look at it, just to remind you and the audience, it could be obvious visual tech like Ezra's MRI full body, or it could be a very small piece of the puzzle using microscopes or advanced microscopes to enable it. It doesn't have to be Instagram, which is all photos or visual. It can be a piece of the puzzle that enables the success of the business.
Yeah. So, there was 23andMe, obviously, and then currently a company called Nurture Genomics that does DNA analysis for newborns and looks for treatable or curable conditions. So things that are rare, but when you sum them all up, they're actually quite common.
Okay.
Then in a very different direction, you mentioned open water. They're a really interesting one. They started doing basically ultrasound for detection of strokes. And then now they're in the middle of discovering there's certain frequencies. We already know they can influence the function of the brain. They can actually also interfere with certain cancers, which it's kind of early and really interesting. Anyway, they've also are now their tech, or sort of their IP, is now open source.
Interesting. So Mary Lou spoke last year on a fireside chat with us at our summit. She's amazing.
Yeah. So this is new, but since last year, they're sort of turning themselves into the Red Hat, which was the company that made money off basically infrastructure around Unix, which was open source. Yeah. And I think people are going to discover, interestingly, IP is going to be so cheap in some ways because AI can create it, but making it work and doing it in the real world becomes very expensive.
Right.
And another one is BAMF, Bold Advanced Medical Futures Health, which actually cures cancer using radiopharmaceuticals. And they detect it, with light waves and things, and then like a PET scan, and then the interesting thing about using, instead of looking for, basically you find the metastases as well as the tumor. At one end, PSA gives way too many false positives.
Right.
And that's the problem, in essence, that Ezra AI solves by doing MRIs and so forth, looking for prostate cancer. But then the second problem is finding all the instances. And that's done better by following the metabolism, because both the primary tumor and each little speck of cancer is sucking up nutrients because it's growing faster than the body around it. So you can detect through this kind of local metabolism where the metastases are. And they're going after treatment-resistant cancer and actually not so much curing it, but just destroying it. It's not very intelligent. It just seeks out this little instance of metabolism, and all the radioactive material also concentrates there, kills the thing, and then you have to excrete the rest pretty quickly if you're the patient and put it into a lead surrounded sewage system. So the logistics of doing that are fairly complicated, but so is the AI that helps them, and the visualization that helps them do that.
And it's interesting, as they've come a long way. They've been working on deep tech for a while, but when you decided to invest or partner, it was, how many, in the earliest days when it was just, what existed, just to give the audience context of, your level, what were there any prototypes, anything that was already built, or was it pure investment in Mary Lou and the team and very early?
Mary Lou was, to be honest, I don't remember exactly. She was detecting stroke. The curative part wasn't there yet. With Ezra, I was the first check-in because I'd known Emmy from a previous company.
When he used to wear his red shoes.
Yes. And with BAMF, again, they were already there. They had gotten $20 million from the guy whose life they saved using this technology in Germany, where it was already permitted, and so forth.
So,
So
another one you were talking about where Latimer recently you invested
yes,
in, and they're building a large language model tool trained on data from Black culture and history. Tell us about that, and John, who I've known for years as well,
yes,
who now also works in in our office, in our mutual office. So
right.
tell us about that and what they're
Well,
doing and why you're involved.
yeah, I mean, again, I think people are way too excited about the LLMs and not putting enough attention on what they are being trained on. So LLMs are kind of being trained on, unfortunately, mostly fast food and then some gourmet restaurants, but they're totally missing a lot of other smaller cultures and other smaller worlds. And as LLMs keep training themselves almost on themselves, they're going to become almost entirely fast food. And the issue is finding good training sets that make the work of the LLMs better rather than homogenizing it further. And that's an interesting problem around AP and social issues and a lot of IP, not AP.
That's right. But what it's going to be, I mean, like, I think what you're saying as well, just to reiterate, is each of these different verticals or sectors of expertise or knowledge or culture, there's going to have to be more of that information in delivered as answers from the prompts. Otherwise, they're not going to be accurate and trust. So we're coming full circle from how we started our fireside chat about, the right questions, the right information about different cultures and different expertise, and which it just doesn't all exist yet.
There's accuracy, but there's also, one word is inclusion, but a better word is, things are missing. Things disappear from the LLM world that should be noticed. And so this is one problem in LLMs. It's a problem in a lot of clinical trials. If you throw out the outliers, you miss the variety, you miss the counterfactuals. It all turns into mashed potatoes. And you want something that contains chunks of the original that you might miss.
Right.
It's not even so much, it's biased, but it's biased by leaving things out in many
by leaving
cases,
things out,
by ignoring,
yeah, that makes sense. I agree.
And to me, the value of AI is in counterfactuals. I can look at a room of kids in a poor school and say, 30% of these will never graduate from high school. 30% will be on drugs by the time they're 20. Okay, that's a prediction. But how do I change that prediction? By changing the present, rather than I want to know, what would it be like if each of these kids had a tutor that knew the kid's name and cared for them? What would it be like if we changed the school food so that they didn't develop a taste for crappy food? What would it be like if they read Latimer and saw people like themselves as scientists? And
I think it'd be quite impactful. I agree. We got a couple more minutes left, and I have so many questions, and we can go on forever, but we've got many people coming up after us. We've talked about a couple new projects you're working on, 2 books. Tell us about these books. What's next?
So one book is what I learned at Wellville, with a very wonky title called "Don't Rent Your Community's Health from an Absentee Landlord." And those words are carefully chosen. Invest in your and your community's health, and then get that absentee landlord, the federal government, to pay for the human capital that is so valuable. Second one is called "Present Without Leave," which is, interesting conversations with Bill Gates that will be in the book.
Cool. Both of them sound fascinating.
Yep.
Are you doing them both at the same time, or are they, is one? I mean, what are you thinking?
I'm sort of starting both of them by blogging now, and then we'll incorporate that into the books. And it's going to be very interesting. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank
We
you.
got 1 minute left. A couple more questions. They're real quick ones. I love these to kind of end on.
Okay.
In one word answers, Esther, what is the best and worst personality trait of an entrepreneur? In a one word answer.
Hustle.
Hustle is the good. And then what would be least best?
The bad. You said
Yeah,
you wanted one word. Hustle.
One of each. Oh, hustle is both?
Yes.
I love that. Okay, good. And now the other one is, if you were to use the same one word for both, or one word for best and one word for least best for investors. You've worked with a lot of angel investors. I mean, what is one that is the personality trait that, makes you cringe?
Well, mine would be, my worst would be short-term interest.
Yeah.
And my best would be purpose and impact. And
good words. Okay. One on the last question is, let's end it with, what visual technology are you most excited about in the next 20 years? Is there one that, relates to maybe something you mentioned earlier, or something that you're saying, wow, I can't wait to see, hopefully that happen?
Human vision of the future.
Human vision of the future. Okay, we're going to start looking for great people to co-invest with on that subject. How's that sound, Esther?
Making good hallucinations come true.
I love it. That's a great topic to end on. Esther, it's been a privilege and an inspiration, and thank you very much for joining us.